I've been sitting on this for a long time, and honestly I'm not even sure why I'm writing it here instead of taking it to the grave like most of the other things I've done. Maybe it's because the older I get, the more the details feel like they want to surface on their own. So yeah, I'm William. And this is about the first time I learned how fragile truth really is when you know where to look in the paperwork. Back then, I wasn't anyone important. Just a low-level contractor working around municipal logistics, transport schedules, inventory logs, incident reports. Boring stuff. The kind of job where nobody looks at you twice unless something goes wrong. And something did go wrong. There was an incident involving a shipment discrepancy tied to a local facility project I was indirectly connected to. Nothing dramatic on the surface, just missing materials, conflicting reports, and a timeline that didn't quite add up. But I knew one of the supervisors involved. Not close, but enough that when things started spiraling, I got pulled in to help clarify documentation. That's where everything shifted for me. Because I realized very quickly that nobody was actually looking for the truth. They were looking for a version of it that wouldn't cause them trouble. And I understood that language better than I should have. At first, I told myself I was just cleaning things up, fixing inconsistencies, making sure innocent people didn't get dragged into something messy just because of sloppy record-keeping. That's what I genuinely believed I was doing. But there was a moment, small, almost invisible, when I noticed how easy it was to redirect attention. How a single detail, placed differently in a report, could change the entire direction of an investigation without anyone realizing it wasn't organic. That was the first time I understood what substitution really meant. Not just changing something. Replacing the frame people used to see it. I didn't act immediately. I remember that clearly. I spent days just going over documents, not altering anything yet, just observing patterns, weak points, the places where assumptions were doing more work than facts. And I told myself I was only thinking, not doing. That distinction didn't last very long. Because once you see the structure of something like that, once you understand how easily it bends, you don't really get to unsee it. That's where it started. And I guess that's where I should pause for now. Next part is where I actually made the first move, and where things stopped being theoretical. The first real decision didn't feel like a decision at all. That's something I've never been able to explain properly to anyone. There was a routine report that needed final verification. A simple chain of custody document tied to the missing shipment. Nothing glamorous. Just timestamps, signatures, internal routing codes. The kind of thing people assume is boring and therefore honest. But I found an inconsistency, one of those tiny gaps where two entries didn't align by about 40 minutes. Normally, that would have just been flagged and corrected. Except I was the one holding the correction access. I remember sitting there after hours, the office almost empty, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee. I kept staring at the same line in the log, thinking about how fragile it was. How it depended entirely on trust in whoever typed it first. I didn't rewrite everything. Not at first. I just adjusted one reference point. One timestamp. A substitution so small it barely registered as a change. When I hit save, I told myself I was aligning data. But I already knew I had crossed a line, just one that didn't scream when you stepped over it. After that first edit, I expected something to happen. A warning, maybe? A ripple. Some kind of immediate consequence that would force me to stop and reassess. Nothing came. That silence was worse than if I'd been caught. Because it suggested the system wasn't fragile in a dramatic way, it was fragile in a lazy one. It only noticed what it was actively trained to notice. The next day, people were still talking about the discrepancy, but now the conversation had already shifted. Instead of, "What happened?" it became, "Which department probably messed up?" That's when I understood the real danger wasn't in changing a fact. It was in guiding interpretation. I started paying closer attention to how reports were read, not just how they were written. Who skimmed? Who double-checked? Who trusted summaries instead of raw logs? I didn't make another change immediately. I just watched. But the idea had already settled in my head. If one small adjustment could redirect suspicion away from a person, what else could it redirect? I told myself I was still just observing. But I was already thinking like someone who planned to act again. The second time I changed something, I didn't hesitate as much. There was a follow-up review being prepared, standard procedure when discrepancies persist. More eyes, more scrutiny, more risk. I remember feeling this low pressure in my chest, like the situation was tightening around me even though nobody had directly pointed at me. The problem was a maintenance log tied to the same shipment chain. One entry suggested a vehicle had been rerouted without authorization. That detail alone could have escalated the whole thing into something serious for the driver involved. I checked everything twice. Then 3 times. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel justified. And then I adjusted the entry. Not erased. Not fabricated. Just clarified. A different route code. A corrected entry format that made the reroute look approved through a secondary channel. It worked immediately. The narrative shifted without resistance. What surprised me wasn't that it worked, it was how fast people accepted the new version once it looked cleaner than the old one. That's when I stopped thinking of it as fixing mistakes. By the third intervention, I wasn't even pretending it was about fixing inconsistencies anymore, not in my head, at least. Out loud, I kept the same language. It's funny how quickly you learn to maintain 2 narratives, the one you live in, and the one you present. This time, the issue involved a missing confirmation signature. A supervisor had allegedly approved a transfer, but the documentation trail was incomplete. It should have been a simple escalation. But I had access to archived routing metadata, and that's where things got interesting. There was a digital footprint, barely visible, that suggested the approval could have been processed through an automated fallback system during a network delay. That became everything. I remember sitting there longer than I needed to, not because the work was difficult, but because I was measuring myself against it. Like I needed proof that I still understood boundaries. I inserted a correction note referencing system fallback authorization. It wasn't even a lie in the traditional sense. It was a possibility presented as a clarification. And once again, the system accepted it without question. What stayed with me afterward wasn't the success. It was how unremarkable it felt. That's when I started noticing something I didn't expect. I wasn't just changing records anymore. I was changing people's positions inside a story they thought was already fixed. The supervisor tied to the missing signature became a key example of how system delays could cause documentation gaps. Instead of suspicion, he got reassigned training materials on procedural logging. A quiet correction of his reputation, all based on something I nudged into existence. I should have felt relief. Maybe even pride, if I'm being honest. But what I felt was something flatter, like emotional numbness mixed with alertness. Because now I knew how little effort it took. One corrected line. One adjusted assumption. One replaced timestamp. And suddenly an entire chain of accountability bends in a different direction. I started thinking about scale. Not in a dramatic way, not like, how far can I take this? But more like, how many of these small adjustments already exist without anyone noticing? That question didn't make me stop. It made me more careful. And being careful, I learned, is not the same as being ethical. Things might have stayed small if it had just been internal logs. Quiet corrections, minor shifts, nothing that would ever matter outside a spreadsheet. But then someone higher up got involved. There was a formal inquiry opened, not a full investigation, but enough to bring in external auditors. That changed everything. External people don't rely on the same assumptions. They don't trust the way things are usually done. For the first time, I felt actual pressure. I remember the meeting where it was announced. Everyone suddenly became sharper, more cautious. Conversations got shorter. Emails got longer. People started documenting things they would have normally handled verbally. And I realized something uncomfortable. The environment I had been quietly manipulating was about to be examined by people who didn't share its blind spots. That's when I understood I had a problem. Not because I'd made changes, but because those changes were now part of a larger structure being tested for integrity. I went back through everything I had touched. Every edit, every clarification, every subtle substitution. For the first time since this started, I wasn't thinking about control. I was thinking about exposure. I didn't panic. At least, not in the way people usually describe it. No shaking hands, no dramatic "I'm done for" moment. It was quieter than that. More like a constant pressure sitting just behind my eyes while I worked. The auditors requested full access logs, edit histories, timestamps, user credentials. Not just final documents, but how they evolved. That's when it hit me. I hadn't erased anything. I had relied on subtlety, not invisibility. So now I had to adapt. I started reconstructing my own trail, but not by deleting it. That would have been obvious. Instead, I focused on context. I added supporting notes where there had been none before. Cross-reference changes with system alerts, minor outages, procedural updates. I wasn't removing evidence. I was surrounding it with noise. The goal wasn't to make my actions disappear. It was to make them indistinguishable from normal system behavior. I worked late every night that week, carefully layering explanations over each change I'd made. And the strange part? The more I did it, the more legitimate everything started to look, even to me. The first real crack didn't come from the auditors. It came from someone I hadn't accounted for. Her name was Elena, mid-level analyst, quiet, the type of person people underestimate because she doesn't speak unless she's certain. I'd seen her around before, but never paid much attention. Until she asked a question no one else had. It was during a routine review session. Everyone was focused on the big discrepancies, the shipment gap, the routing confusion, the timeline overlaps. Standard stuff. But Elena zeroed in on something smaller. She pointed out that one of the corrected entries, my corrected entries, had a formatting inconsistency that didn't match the system's usual auto-generated patterns. Not the content. The structure. That's what got her. I remember feeling this sharp drop in my stomach. Not panic again, just that same cold awareness tightening. Because she wasn't looking at what the data said. She was looking at how it looked. And that's much harder to control. I responded carefully, something about manual overrides during system lag. It was plausible. Technically accurate, even. She didn't push. But she didn't look convinced either. And that stayed with me. After that meeting, Elena didn't confront me directly. That would have been easier. Instead, she started asking for more data. Quietly. Methodically. Pulling extended logs, comparing revision layers, requesting older backups that most people wouldn't even think to check. She never accused anyone, never raised her voice, she just kept digging. And the worst part? Nobody stopped her. Because on paper, she was doing exactly what the auditors wanted, being thorough. I considered rolling things back. Undoing certain edits, letting inconsistencies reappear so the trail would scatter again. But that carried its own risk. Sudden reversals draw attention in a different way. So I stayed the course. I doubled down on consistency. Matched formatting more precisely. Studied system-generated entries so closely that I could mimic them without thinking. But there was a shift inside me. Before, I was shaping the narrative. Now, I was reacting to someone else trying to reconstruct it. And that changes the balance completely. Because once someone starts looking at patterns instead of outcomes, it's only a matter of time before they stop trusting the story altogether. The turning point came a few days later, and it wasn't dramatic. No confrontation. No accusations thrown across a room. Just an email. Elena sent out a request for a clarification session, with a small group, me included. The wording was neutral, almost boring. But the attachments told a different story. She had compiled a comparison sheet. Not just of the discrepancies everyone already knew about, but of formatting patterns, revision intervals, and something I hadn't expected, keystroke timing logs. That last one caught me off guard. I hadn't even considered that layer. The system tracked not just what was changed, but how it was entered, manual typing versus automated population, even the rhythm of edits in some cases. And suddenly, all my careful harmonizing felt thinner. During the session, she didn't accuse me directly. She just walked through the data, pointing out irregularities in a calm, almost detached way. But every example circled closer to my work. I responded where I could. Technical explanations, system lag, manual overrides. They were still plausible. But for the first time, they felt like they were being measured, not accepted. After that session, the atmosphere shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. People didn't treat me differently outright. No one pulled me aside, no sudden cold shoulders. But there was a subtle change in how conversations paused when I joined, how questions were phrased just a little more carefully around me. It wasn't suspicion in the open. It was distance. I started noticing how often my access logs were being referenced in meetings. Not singled out, just included more frequently. Like my work had become part of the interesting areas, worth double-checking. And Elena? She stopped asking broad questions. Instead, she started narrowing in. Specific entries. Specific timestamps. Specific actions that only I had touched. Still no accusations. That was the unsettling part, she didn't need them. Because by then, the narrative I had been shaping was no longer the dominant one. A new version was forming, built not on what made sense, but on what didn't quite fit. I realized something then that I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I wasn't in control of the story anymore. I was part of the evidence. The official escalation came quietly, an internal notice that the inquiry was being expanded. More oversight, tighter controls, limited editing access. No names mentioned, but I didn't need one to know where this was heading. My permissions were reduced the same day. Not revoked, just narrowed. Enough to do my job, not enough to shape anything beyond it. That was the first real consequence I felt. Up until then, everything had been internal, calculations, adjustments, responses. Now the system itself was pushing back. I thought about coming clean more than once. Not out of guilt, not exactly, but out of a strange desire to regain control of the narrative by owning it. But every version of that conversation ended the same way, with me explaining something that sounded worse out loud than it ever had in my head. So I stayed silent. Watched as Elena's framework solidified. As her version of events, careful, pattern-based, almost clinical, started replacing mine. And the strangest part? She never once said I intended anything. She didn't need to. Because intent doesn't matter much when the structure itself tells the story. The outcome, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. No interrogation room. No one slamming evidence down in front of me. Just a formal review meeting with HR and compliance. They walked me through their findings in a measured, almost careful tone. Not accusatory, more like they were describing a pattern they had already accepted as fact. Unauthorized modifications. Procedural deviations. Inconsistencies in documentation behavior. They never used the word intentional. That stuck with me. Because it created this strange space where I wasn't being labeled outright, but I also wasn't being defended by ambiguity anymore. I gave my explanations. The same ones I'd been refining for weeks. System lag. Manual corrections. Misinterpretation of protocols. They listened. Took notes. Nodded. And then they told me my contract would be terminated. No legal action. No escalation beyond internal records. Just removal. I walked out of that building feeling something I hadn't expected. Not relief. Not panic. Just a kind of emptiness. Like the entire structure I had been carefully bending had finally reset itself, without me in it. It's been a few years since all of that happened. I've had other jobs since then. Nothing with that level of access, obviously. Different environments, different systems. But the habits, they don't disappear as easily as you'd think. I still notice things most people ignore. Patterns, inconsistencies, the small gaps where assumptions do the heavy lifting. And sometimes I catch myself thinking about how easy it would be to shift something again, just slightly. That's the part one don't like admitting. Because the lesson I expected to learn was about consequences. Getting caught, losing the job, the quiet damage to my record. But that's not what stayed with me. What stayed with me is how little it took. How the truth, at least in systems like that, isn't some solid thing. It's a structure built on trust, repetition, and formatting that looks right. If you're reading this and thinking about cutting corners, adjusting details, cleaning up something small, don't. Not because you'll definitely get caught, but because you'll start seeing how everything can be adjusted. And once you see that, it's very hard to convince yourself to stop.